I'm here to talk to you about arguably the most important organ in the human body, the brain. And I just want to preface this by saying I am not a neuroscientist in no way, shape, or form. I don't have all the answers or knowledge behind the brain. I am an educator, specifically an early educator working with children, infants, toddlers, and preschool age. So we focus on the basics of the brain in this field and how it relates to the growth and development of children in the youngest years of their lives. So I have a little model of the brain here and just some basic facts about the brain I want to share. The brain is comprised of two hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere, and each hemisphere is pretty much identical to each other. It's connected by the structure called the corpus callosum, which is essentially like a highway to the brain. It allows a quick access of information between the hemispheres. And while the two hemispheres are identical, they do have different functions that they specialize in. The left hemisphere specializes in language and calculations, whereas the right hemisphere specializes in visual, spatial recognition, facial recognition. So while they do have their little differences, they still work together as one unit, and you need both pieces of your brain for it to function correctly and fully. Um, so each section of the brain, it's comprised of four lobes and a cerebellum. Um, so we have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. And then down here is the cerebellum. It also has a brain stem, which connects it to the spinal column. In each section of the brain, it has a different function to it. And a pretty cool fact, the way the brain develops is very reminiscent to how development in any other human system develops. It's sequential and happens in a, a specific pattern, a predictable pattern. Um, so essentially, it goes kind of like that direction. It starts kind of from down here to the middle and then up, but also it goes from the back to the front. Um, So we'll start with the brainstem. The function of the brainstem is breathing, heart rate, temperature, any of the essential survival mechanisms that are basically unconscious to us. They just happen on their own. The brainstem is in charge of that. You have the cerebellum, which is in charge of coordination and balance. You have the occipital lobe, which is in charge of vision. And this is the first lobe that develops. And you can see this in infants where they are looking at different things before they're interacting with them. They use their eyes to interact with the world and receive all that sensory information. And then you have the parietal lobe, which is in charge of touch and pressure, taste, body awareness, language. This reminds me of, I kind of think of it as like the movement section. And then you have the temporal lobe, which is hearing, facial recognition, learning, and I kind of think of this as the language. And then finally, you have the frontal lobe, which is in charge of motor control, concentration, planning, problem solving. And I like to think of this as like the cognitive section of the brain. And so what's interesting is the brain, it recognizes sensory input and instantaneously, it gets all the sensory input around it and it kind of sorts it into the appropriate location of the brain. And this forms like neural connections. And fun fact, per second, over 1 million neural connections are made, which is really unfathomable to think about that this is happening every moment of our lives. Um, but these neural connections, they are like processed instantly, but they don't form the neural pathways instantly. That takes practice and repetition to make these pathways strong and connected. This is why like it takes quite a bit of practice, not just in like little kids, but in adults as well, to like learn new skills and things, because all these neural connections are forming in the pathways, strengthening, so that we would be able to do these things instantaneously. Um, and an interesting fact is that the most crucial brain development happens between the ages of 0 and 3. Um, and all these connections are forming and forming and forming. And by the time the child is between the ages of 3 and 5, the brain is actually pruning away the unused connections. So it does that in order to kind of like make it easier to go down these like pathways. Like imagine it like you're on the expressway and there's lots of like different ways you can take, but if you eliminate like some of the options, like it's a straighter path to get to where you need to go, like there's no like quote unquote like detours in the way. So that kind of happens with pruning, so that the pathways are very strong and it's even easier to access the information and the knowledge and that skill. um, so overall, the brain is in need of 6 things: food, sleep, oxygen, water, novelty, and challenge. And those are these 6 things that set the basis for all brain development. And without those things, the brain suffers and it doesn't like develop fully as the organ as we need it to function. But I have some tips to share with you to make sure that your child, a child in your care, or even if you're planning to have children one day, any child that's going to be in your life, to help them um, have the best and optimal brain development that they can. So, first and foremost, it's eliminating any excess stress on a young child's brain, and definitely eliminating any long-term adverse trauma experiences. That is probably the number one detriment to a developing brain. It actually changes the way the pathways are formed, and it's not really ever a good thing to have severe trauma in a child, especially at such a young age. But something you can do, and is fairly easy to do, are all these next steps. You can provide a consistent and predictable environment that helps the child, like practice makes perfect. They recognize the different stimuli in their environment, they know how to react, and it's strengthening all these connections and pathways in the brain. But also engage your child in many novel experiences, such as new sounds, new words, touches, textures, just giving them a wide variety of experiences helps challenge the brain to learn more, and it absorbs more information. And then make sure you're supplying sufficient nutrition, plenty of water, plenty of sleep, as these are like the ingredients, that the brain needs to really function. And then, most and foremost, just interact frequently, have these serve and return interactions. You interact, baby interacts, or toddler, young child, and you just take turns going back and forth. You can imitate what they do. You can scaffold new skills, which is where um, you basically add like a little bit more to the pot, like each time, to put it like colloquially. You just kind of know like your child's baseline skill, and you just add a little next level difficulty to it and help them reach that next stair. And you just keep going as they learn, like their new baseline goes up and up, and you just follow along with that. And then this all, this whole thing we've been talking about today, this is the foundation for all later learning, making sure that the brain is developing optimally is crucial for later learning as an adolescent, as an adult. Um, but don't worry if you're not perfect. If your child's environment is not perfect, if you feel like you're not providing the perfect experiences, because nothing's perfect. And humans are very adaptable and they're very malleable, especially the youngest ones, and they'll meld into their environment. And it's just like our goal as the adults in the situation to help guide the child to an environment that has positive experiences, and just as many as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect. That doesn't mean you're never going to have any um, negative experiences in your life, in the child's life. It's not as important to shield them from the negative as it is to provide an excess amount of positive experiences. And sometimes it will feel like we're falling short of that goal, but it's always important to remember that as long as our child is happy, healthy, growing, and surrounded by positive things as much as they can be, they're going to grow and develop just fine. And it's important to remember that we're all human, even the littlest ones. And it's like in our human nature to be adaptable and make the best of our environments. So thank you for listening today. I hope you learn a little bit more about the brain, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.